In 1924, at a mental hospital in New York, an elderly man kept telling the doctors the same thing over and over. I remember, before the Great Flood came, the city was completely different. The buildings were different. People spoke differently. The doctors locked him up with a schizophrenia diagnosis, and he never got out again. But what if that man really did remember something? What if the real purpose of those massive, magnificent, palace-like mental hospital buildings that sprang up like mushrooms all over the world in the late 1800s wasn't treatment, but silencing? Today, I'm going to tell you one of history's darkest secrets. What happened to the witnesses who survived the Mudflood, the Great Flood? And believe me, after you hear this story, you'll never look at mental health institutions the same way again. You've watched dozens of videos about Tartaria theory and Mudflood narratives, underground cities, erased histories, inexplicable architectural wonders, lost technologies. But did you ever wonder about the biggest logical gap in these theories? If a global catastrophe really happened in the mid-1800s, if a giant civilization really ended up buried underground, if history really was rewritten, then what happened to the people who saw, remembered, and knew this? Millions of people experienced this catastrophe. Their families were buried underground. Cities were buried overnight. Then what? Did they all just stay silent and accept it? No. This is where mental hospitals come into play. Between 1850 and 1920, right in the post-Mudflood period, more than 300 massive mental hospitals were built in North America and Europe. And this isn't just about numbers. The architecture of these buildings, their size, their locations, and the fact that they all appeared almost simultaneously carries clues to a terrifying story. These massive structures, known as the Kirkbride Plan, were magnificent, palace-like buildings incomparable to today's hospitals. Marble columns, magnificent stained glass windows, corridors hundreds of meters long, their own power plants, water systems. For a mental patient? Was all this grandeur really necessary for treatment? Or were these built for another purpose? Perhaps structures belonging to the old world built much earlier and repurposed after the catastrophe? What's even more disturbing is this. When you look at the records of who entered these hospitals and why, you see complete chaos. Melancholic, hysteria, moral decay, religious delusions, obsession about the past, even being overly educated, were enough to receive a mental illness diagnosis. A woman opposing her husband, a man doubting the state, someone remembering the old days differently, all were reasons to be locked in a hospital. So were these people really insane? Or did they know things that needed to be silenced? What historians don't tell you is this. There was an incredible explosion in the mental hospital population in the late 1800s. Why? The official explanation is industrialization, stress, urbanization, pressure of modern life. But the real question to ask is, why did this increase reach its peak exactly when the post-Mudflood generation was aging? Why did this rush to hospitals begin exactly when new identity systems, censuses, and surname laws came into effect? Think about it. If Mudflood really happened, there was a generation in their 20s and 30s in the 1850s who witnessed the catastrophe firsthand. These people are aging in the 1880s and 1890s and starting to tell their grandchildren. In our time, the city wasn't like this. The buildings were different. There was another world underground. And right at this point, they're declared senile, delusional, melancholic, and locked up in mental hospitals. A coincidence? Maybe. But when you look at the treatments applied in these hospitals, the coincidence theory collapses. Electroshock, lobotomy, cold water cures, isolation cells. These weren't treatments, they were memory erasure methods. Do you know what the most common side effect of electroshock treatment is? Retrograde amnesia, meaning the erasure of past memory. Exactly what needed to be forgotten by people who remembered the old world. And lobotomy? cutting the frontal lobe, meaning the surgical destruction of personality, memories, identity. These procedures peaked in the 1940s and 50s, but their foundations were laid in the 1890s. Why? Because that generation was now dying and their memory needed to be completely erased. Now let me tell you something even more horrifying. Most of these hospitals operated as orphanages and mental hospital school complexes. In other words, children who had lost their families after the catastrophe, who weren't registered, who had no one, were gathered in these places. And what were these children taught? New history, new identity, new reality. The old world stories their grandfathers told them were forbidden, punished. These children reached adulthood having forgotten the past, and thus an entire generation was completely erased. When you examine these buildings architecturally, the suspicions deepen even further. Most of the Kirkbride hospitals carry features specific to Tartaria architecture: star-shaped plans, central domes, mysterious underground tunnel networks, giant basement floors, corridors wide enough for trains. If these were really built between 1850 to 1900, how were they made in such a short time, so perfectly, all similar to each other? Or did they already exist and were simply repurposed? Mysterious machine remnants found in some hospital basements, unexplainable energy systems, giant water tanks. Were these made for a hospital or for something else? And the most disturbing detail, almost all of these hospitals, when old maps are examined, were built right on top of places marked as administrative centers or energy stations during the Tartaria period. Coincidence? Now let's get to the most shocking evidence: personal testimonies. In the early 1900s, many patients who escaped from or were discharged from mental hospitals wrote their memoirs. There's a recurring theme in these memoirs: "I wasn't crazy, I was just telling the truth." One man writes, "I described the old city my father told me about, and they locked me up." A woman, "I found my grandfather's buried books, started reading them, then ended up in the hospital." Another, "I saw the tunnels in the basement, and they told me not to tell anyone, but I told." These people were declared paranoid, delusional, dangerous. But today, those researching Mudflood theory are saying the same things, and no one is locking them up in mental hospitals. Because that generation is now dead, the danger is past. Memory has been erased. The system no longer has a secret to protect because everyone has forgotten. So why was all this hidden and concealed? Because Mudflood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a civilization reset. In the old world, people lived differently. Free energy, advanced technology, perhaps a different social order. And the new order didn't want the old order to be remembered. Mental hospitals were the final link in this great forgetting operation. First, buildings were covered with earth, then maps were changed, then books were burned, surnames were imposed, censuses were conducted, and finally, the last generation that remembered all this was declared insane and isolated from society. And thus history was rewritten. Today, when you mention Tartaria, people laugh, call it a conspiracy theory. But if your grandfather had told you, "I remember that city," in the 1890s, they would have locked him up not in prison, but in a mental hospital. Think about it now. Perhaps what you call conspiracy theories today are actually the last screams of those silenced in those mental hospitals. So was the real purpose of mental hospitals to silence those who survived the Mudflood? Here's the answer. Maybe not in the beginning, but over time it was definitely used for this purpose. Because the most effective way to control a society is to control its past. And the surest way to control the past is to declare those who remember that past mentally ill, and destroy and silence them. In the early 20th century, hundreds of thousands of people were locked up in mental hospitals, received electroshock, were lobotomized, and died or were killed in silence because they remembered the wrong things. Their stories, records, memories were thrown in the trash as the ravings of lunatics. But today those ravings are slowly emerging. Underground cities are being found, old technologies are being discovered, buildings that don't fit official history are being documented. And perhaps those lunatics weren't crazy at all. Perhaps they were just the last people who told the truth. And those people lost their lives because they struggled to tell the truth, the reality.